going to be up here, if you could start making your way here now. Joining me tonight for the Q&A will be Georganne Chapin, the director of Intactivist. And Brian Earp. Brian Earp has more academic credentials than I could possibly list. He's been at Oxford and Yale, and Ashley Trueman, who is the Parenting Education Director at Your Whole Baby, and who studied at Oxford. So yeah. So, this Q&A is going to be whatever you guys want it to be in terms of what you're interested in learning about this issue and what you're interested in asking these amazing people up here. But before I start, is there anything that you guys want to add at the opening?
Great film.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Brendon, for making this film.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you for supporting me on this very long journey, longer than I expected initially.
Can I give a little current event update before people start with their questions?
Sure.
The very influential Edgar Schoen passed away in the last year. And he was the head of pediatrics at Kaiser Permanente in Northern California, in Sacramento, the part of California that has the highest circumcision rate, and he was a big power behind the circumcision practice in that department of Kaiser. And there were pediatricians in the department. There's a pediatrician named Steve Dorfman who I've been talking to for several years, and they felt greatly the relief of Schoen's passing. And I've been invited on Tuesday following the symposium, March 8th, to speak to the Department of Pediatrics at Kaiser Northern California. Something that never would have happened as long as Schoen was alive, so really. May, sorry. May.
For those who may not know, Schoen is the person from the American Academy of Pediatrics with the bow tie in the film. So you are now familiar with him as a character, so when we'll talk about particular figures and this issue, hopefully you'll be a little more familiar with who they're talking about. So I think we can open up to questions now, unless you guys have anything else you want to add. That's really good news, by the way. Right up here in the front.
My question is, it's difficult for me and somewhat frustrating when I see the gentleman from, well, both the gentleman that passed away, the gentleman from Australia, who have a radically different, they make statements that contradict other people's statements about what scientific evidence there is or is not. And that's difficult for me, and I wonder if anybody can shed some light on that difference. Is there a truth that we can point to with confidence and people are misrepresenting it? Or is it really something that is still not well established?
I could say something about this because this is the main area that I work in the professional literature. So a couple of things. One dimension that might have been in the film was sort of the European response to the American Academy of Pediatrics policy. So the drama of the film played out between sort of the American Academy of Pediatrics and a couple of spokespeople there, and then sort of the Intactivists on the other side. The thing that's amazing about a lot of so-called Intactivists or Intactivists is that many of them really know what they're talking about. Because it's a passion cause, they've taken the time to get to know the medical literature in the way that gay activists in the 1980s got to know the literature about AIDS treatments, for example, because they wanted access. And so they became, in a sense, lay experts. So there's something like that playing out here, but you don't have to just pit the AAP against Intactivists, many of whom, as I say, know what they're talking about. You could look at basically the rest of the medical profession globally. So about a month after the American Academy of Pediatrics policy came out in 2012, or maybe it was a few months later, a sort of consortium of 38 senior doctors in Europe, including heads and representatives of medical societies, published a rebuttal entitled Cultural Bias in the 2012 AAP policy on circumcision. And they went through each claim and said, this is not the position of doctors who looked at the same evidence and yet are not themselves lacking the tissue that you might assign value to. And in fact, European doctors do assign value to this tissue, so they would think that you need to have a very good reason to cut it off, and a few sketchy benefits wouldn't be sufficient. I'll say one thing about Brian Morris. I don't know if I want to say this on film because, oh boy. So
Go for it.
he sort of outed himself in response to this paper, so I'll just give you the title. I wrote an essay called The Unbearable Asymmetry of Bullshit, which was published in Health Watch magazine, and I have a character in it named Lord Voldemort. And Lord Voldemort is someone who spends his whole career pumping studies into the literature that are so replete with fallacies that if you wanted to rebut them, you would have to essentially stop everything that you're doing, and your whole career would be spent trying to do a point-by-point analysis, and then half the journals wouldn't publish it because your rebuttal would be 10 times as long as the paper that was published. Now, in some paper that I saw recently, he seemed to think that he was Lord Voldemort because he referred to my paper and sort of said, Earp, I didn't say this in the paper, but that's his own impression. He seems to think he's Lord Voldemort on this reading. And I will say that I did at one point take 6 months of my life to rebut a paper of his in a popular magazine, Skeptic magazine. And it was excruciating. You have to go and read all the references, and you see how they've been a little bit cherry-picked and glossed a certain way, and in order to give the counter-argument, you have to just stop everything else in your life. So it's a sort of gish gallop, which is a debating term, which means if you flood so many fallacies into the conversation, your opponent, who's trying to have a reasoned response, simply doesn't have the time or wherewithal to be able to contest all of your fallacious statements in the context of a debate. And that sort of thing plays out in medical literature as well. So as somebody who spends his whole day looking at the medical literature, I just want to alert people to the fact that it's a highly politicized literature. And so it's very, very hard, actually, unless you're an expert in this specific literature. It's not enough to be a urologist or an epidemiologist or something like that. You have to be a circumcision expert because the literature is replete with a lot of very poorly done studies couched in very scientific sounding language.
Thank you.
The other thing I think bears mentioning is that the American Academy of Pediatrics, the more reasoned voices there, even though we disagree with them, can't get far enough away from Brian Morris, including Andrew Friedman, who was a pediatric urologist who appeared several times in this film. They consider him to be an embarrassment and a kook. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't others like Lauer and Gray who are presenting less hyperbole in advancing the arguments. In those cases, the HIV arguments are from studies that have not been replicated anywhere else in the world, would never be carried out anywhere else in the world that had any ethical standards for their review, and they've essentially bootstrapped their own very flawed findings. As was pointed out in the films, more men lost to follow-up than followed, and continue to repeat the same and extrapolate from their original findings or their original purported findings. So they're sort of on another level than Morris, but Morris is generally discredited by everybody except for himself. But he is very vocal on the topic, which is why you included him.
Thank you.
A quick thing on the HIV studies before we move on from those. There are some who criticize the methodology of the studies. No study is perfect, and so there's always some legitimate route you can take to critique the studies. But I don't tend to do it because even if you accept the findings at face value, they have little to no relevance to newborns in developed countries. The studies were conducted in sub-Saharan Africa of adult men, volunteers. And a basic rule of epidemiology is you can't simply copy and paste findings from one subgroup in one epidemiological environment and then put it over here in a completely different epidemiological environment. I mean, most HIV in the United States is transmitted among gay men and injecting drug users. There's no evidence. Now, there's some studies that have come out where some people are trying to argue that there may be some protective effect for gay men in some contexts, but essentially the quality of the evidence is very poor. So it's from female to male transmission only in sub-Saharan Africa due to voluntary adult circumcision. There was a fourth trial that nobody ever talks about looking at male to female transmission, conducted by Lauer, who was in the video as the lead author. And they had to stop that trial early because the female partners of the circumcised men were contracting HIV at a higher rate. And so they stopped it due to what they call futility. But nobody talks about that study, and certainly they don't tout it in their advertisement of this procedure as they try to export the findings to the United States where they don't apply. So you can critique the findings, and there are some valid critiques of them, but even if you take the findings at face value, the thought that they apply to newborn circumcision in the United States is an absurd extrapolation.
Thank you.
I really appreciate what you said about your essay on bullshit, because the original edit of that sequence on HIV was close to an hour. And of course, that's a really long time, and that would be an entire film just on that one study. And when we do the bonus features, I may release some of that content for people who really want to go deep on that science. But most of the people I talk to would say, what do you mean? You can still get HIV if you're circumcised? Like, that's ridiculous. And so most intactivists take what is probably the smart strategy of saying, we wouldn't frame female circumcision, for example, in terms of medical benefits, and there's no amount of percentages of decreases of a particular type of infection where we would say, oh, well, now it's fine to cut women's bodies. And so they just take it from the area of arguing statistical differences, even though the arguments there are completely legitimate, to the higher value of what are our values and how do we treat people and what are human rights and how do we want to raise our children, and those sort of ethical human questions that are actually the reason that most parents make decisions. So, front here.
First of all, thank you so much for making the film. It was really illuminating. I have two questions, if I may. One is, whoever is the expert on the legal.
David Llewellyn is who I think you're referencing.
No, I mean of the people here tonight.
Oh, okay.
Who can talk about the legal status and how we're approaching it legally, and what our last kind of status is about legal fights to try to outlaw it or minimize it?
I concur, and I don't know who said it in the film.
Can you use your mic?
Oh, sorry, I concur with who, I don't remember who said it in the film, that the law follows culture or society. You can't, I can't, as a human rights activist or as a public health professional, as an attorney, conceive of trotting out legislation to outlaw male circumcision in a country where still 50% or more of babies are circumcised by doctors as though it were a legitimate medical procedure. You don't want to lose that battle, So you wait. Intact America's strategy is to work toward a tipping point so that the culture starts to see the male body, the intact male body, as normal. And once you get to a certain critical mass of people, and we are moving in that direction, who believe that it will become, think of same-sex marriage. You didn't see people in the 70s or in the 60s advocating for same-sex marriage. There were certainly people who wanted that, but they had to wait until the culture, till the society caught up to the idea. And that is where I personally stand on the idea of going for criminalization. I don't think we'll ever actually criminalize male circumcision in this country. I think European experience is illustrative there. So we simply want to get to a point where, we simply want to get to a point where Americans don't want to circumcise their children. However, I also agree that we should not permit any backsliding on the FGM laws. Right? They are inconsistent. They are hypocritical in the sense that they don't protect boys, but that doesn't mean we go with the AAP's 2010 original statement, which says it's okay to do it to girls now.
If I could make a comment on this, there's a very relevant case playing out in Detroit, Michigan right now, which is the first federal prosecution for FGM in the United States under the 1996 law. And it concerns a group called the Dawoodi Bohra, which is a small Muslim sect. And very interestingly, they practice both male and female circumcision, as they would refer to it in English. And the form of cutting they do to their daughters is the ritual nick, the very thing that was proposed by the AAP. In other words, it's a form of cutting that on any view is far less invasive than the very same surgery they do to their sons. Furthermore, they support the practice based on the same interpretation of Islamic scripture, basically the hadith, which are the secondary sources of scripture rather than the Quran, where both male and female circumcision have similar scriptural standing. So my view is that the United States has picked the worst possible case to prosecute, and in some communication with those who are around the case, they're completely bungling it. They don't know what they're talking about. They rely on the World Health Organization typology for FGM, which has various anatomical problems and inaccuracies and so forth. So I have no idea how that case is going to go. But if it becomes part of common knowledge that it is already illegal in this country to cut a girl's genitals to any degree, including forms that are less invasive than male circumcision and that are performed by the parents for comparable reasons, then this asymmetry in the double standard is going to come into the conversation. I agree that if you move the law before cultural readiness, you face problems. This happened in Germany, where there was a moment where it seemed like maybe there was going to be an interpretation of the criminal law that said it was already illegal to perform circumcisions for non-medical reasons. As a response, the German legislature panicked and created a specific law to say, we're not going to be the first country, Germany of all places, to outlaw circumcision, and so they created a law saying circumcision must be protected and can't be criticized legally. Similar thing happened in California. The MGM bill had a backfiring effect, where now there's a specific law in place saying you can't even raise a critique of circumcision legally. So the law is one tool among many to make changes in society, and I'm of the view that in this case it's a very clumsy way of doing it, and first you change hearts and minds and the law will follow.
I had a different second question, but now I have just a follow-up to that. Can you talk about what the latest numbers are in terms of surveys or polls about Americans' opposition to circumcision?
Okay, so you'll all hear it from me. Several years ago, Intact America conducted a national survey, which we kept the results private because we thought that they could be misinterpreted. And we found that fewer than 10% of Americans disliked circumcision. It was basically either not on the radar screen or it was something that most Americans approved of.
What year was that?
Where are we now? Stu, what year is that? That was probably 2013? No, 15. Yeah. We also asked many other questions. We asked, and we tested the responses. We had a pre and post survey analysis. We found that the reasons that people approved of it were all of the things, hygiene and health. And we've been conducting. We have another survey we're about to conduct now, along the same lines. We've also done a survey earlier this year on forced foreskin retraction. Found some astonishing numbers on that. So we're trying to measure attitudes as we go ahead. It's extremely expensive to measure public opinion in a legitimate, statistically significant way, but our goal is to continue to measure that. We believe that also media coverage, both social media and mainstream media coverage, are good indicators of public attitudes, and we think we've seen a marked change in that in the last couple of years, a huge amount of coverage of the issue. Even an article that has bad information in it, if it asks the question, clearly reflects a changing social attitude. So we have calculated that this is consistent with other social change movements, that if we could tip the balance, the tipping point of attitude, with between 20 and 24% of Americans disapproving of circumcision, that is what it takes. Same-sex marriage didn't get legalized because 90% or 70% of Americans agreed with it. It was because a critical mass, maybe 20 to 22%, were willing to say they agreed with it, and the rest of the people really didn't care one way or the other. That's how the law got passed, and we believe if we can get 20 to 25% of Americans to appreciate the intact male body, not to hate circumcision, but to appreciate that the intact male body is okay and normal, and the default should be to just leave your baby alone, that we will have really significantly changed the culture.
I know of two other surveys, one of which I conducted very recently and is published in a journal called Culture, Health, and Sexuality. But one was published by YouGov in 2015, also came up with a 10% figure of men who wish they hadn't been circumcised. I did a survey with colleagues at Quinnipiac University where we had a sample of 999, I don't know why we couldn't get 1,000, men who were recruited into the survey not aware that it was about circumcision, so we didn't have a sampling bias or overrepresentation of people who were wanting to participate. We had a figure of about 13.5%. But the point of that study was to see whether people's satisfaction with having been circumcised was related in any way to the amount of knowledge they had about the subject. So you might recall Ron Goldman's informal study from, I think the 90s he published in his book, Circumcision, The Hidden Harm, where he says The men who knew that the foreskin was quite a lot of tissue and that it had value among those who were circumcised were the ones who were really upset. The ones who thought it was something trivial didn't seem to mind. So it seems like there's a clear relationship. So my colleagues and I tried to do an updated version of this where we created a scale with 10 items on it. It took us forever to do, that are 10 statements about which there is an objectively correct answer. So this is, dealing with polarized, confusing medical literature. We came up with 10 statements about foreskin anatomy and health benefits and so forth. And we found this relationship that the more that circumcised men knew about the topic and the anatomy of the foreskin, the more likely they were to be dissatisfied. And the inverse was true for intact men. So I think it's not just a numbers game, it's a knowledge game.
I just want to know from a neurological standpoint, there's been so many breakthroughs with stem cell technology lately, and I wanted to know if there's any impact with Norman, with the restoration movement, if there's been any breakthrough with that, if there's any way to, restoring, obviously, yeah, we know you can't restore those nerve endings, but with all of that medical breakthrough.
Regeneration, you're talking about regeneration?
Yeah, is there any chance that there is a way to move forward with that?
So the short answer is currently no, but there are a small group of people who are working on that idea. And there's a lot of debate about whether or not it's possible, because obviously, if you were to regenerate that would be something that has never been done in the world before. Now, there's a small startup company called Forgen. I hung out with them a bit while they were at South by Southwest that's interested in regenerating that part of the body. And they've done decellularization trials with animals and found that they're able to basically create a scaffolding, so to speak, of stem cells that your body would grow a missing body part into, specifically the foreskin. Again, they've made some progress towards that goal, but they're not there yet. And the earliest, most optimistic estimate that you could give them would probably be 2020, as far as maybe they'll be at human trials by then, and only if they get a significant amount of funding. Now, obviously, because there's a lot of men who are affected by this, and because if they were able to do that, that would be really good. A lot of people are very hopeful they could. But right now, the only options men have are restoration, which we cover in the film.
I think the other thing that we could say about regeneration, even if it becomes feasible scientifically, is this is not a solution for the average male, because it would cost a huge amount of money for individuals. This is not like a plug and play or a turnkey operation here. This would be something that would be significantly expensive. Who knows whether it would be covered by insurance, would be a huge battle. I see it as a very remote solution for most men, and manual restoration seems to be the only thing really on the horizon.
And it doesn't erase the initial human rights violation.
Yeah.
So you can't allow it to become if he doesn't like it, he can just get the restoration.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you gotta, in my view, from education, there's a lot of debate. People throw out specific numbers that come from studies of varying quality. It doesn't matter how many nerves, it doesn't matter how many square inches, it's the initial cut. And so if you can get away from we do parent education, yes, there are some of those issues some of those questions that they have. What's the percentage for the UTI? What's the this? You can address it, but it's the human rights aspect of it. It doesn't matter what the square inch is. It doesn't matter how many deaths. It doesn't matter. It shouldn't be done in the first place. And if you can step away from specific numbers, people who are against your message will take specific numbers and try and discredit and tear that study or that source apart. Doesn't matter, it shouldn't be done in the first place. So we also don't want regeneration to become you can just get it done and erase it.
You in the back.
I have two questions. I think it was Dr. Mark Reese who's teaching medical students about the benefits of being intact and not doing circumcisions. Are other doctors doing that now? And because I know, this is going back at least 15 years ago, in the medical textbooks, they don't talk about the benefits of the foreskin
or they don't depict the foreskin. There's a couple of studies on that where there's just literally no information given to doctors in their anatomy materials about what a foreskin is. It's just simply not even shown on the diagram.
And even the regret, Mom, I mean, many of the circumcision, it's changing on the internet, but many of the childbirth books certainly left it ambiguous or didn't really come out and talk about the benefits of not doing it. So I just wondered if any progress was made there. That's my first question.
That's the toughest one. So I developed a class curriculum for expectant parents many years ago that's gone through many, many iterations, and we're just to the point to get a copyright right and figure out how to get it out to the masses. For midwifery groups and some of the more naturally minded medical providers, they've been quite receptive to having a version of that has been tweaked for a more medically knowledgeable audience. But going more mainstream gets tough for continuing education credits for a hospital or a large pediatric practice, because they always want a specialist to sign off on it for the continuing education credits, and a lot of them don't know a lot of this stuff because they grew up or they went to school with a book that didn't say anything other than flap of skin removed during circumcision. So in my world of education, educating the medical professionals is the toughest one. The people who go to a class to learn about circumcision, I say, are sort of the low-hanging fruit. They're the people that are willing to question it or willing to consider that, hey, maybe we should learn about this. But we are sort of starting to crawl up the ranks to the more mainstream, just for the general awareness with media coverage. And more people are aware that it's at least controversial now, but we're still not at a critical mass where you can really do the tipping point to where, if we can get parents to stop requesting it, if we can get parents to refuse to use providers who perform them, if we can get parents to refuse to go to hospitals that perform them, to refuse to have health insurance coverage that covers them, when it starts hitting it in that other, the more pocket, the other way, it's just another avenue, another side to start to make change happen more quickly.
One of the things that is true is that medical schools, are huge institutions and very mainstream, and so any physician who wants to take up this cause within a medical school suffers the same kind of risks, really, to his or her career, and we know that from some of the Intactivist doctors in the movement, as do the nurses who protest it, don't want to be part of circumcisions or part of the unit. So it's really still a very radical position a risk for a teaching physician to take this up as a cause. People have lost their jobs without having it said explicitly why. They've been told to cease and desist, much as Maryland was fired years and years ago. People have, I'm aware, have not gotten jobs, and they've been right up to the last minute and thought they were getting an academic job, physicians, and lost it at the last minute. And the only reason that they could think of was that they had spoken out against circumcision.
There's some reason for hope, I think. There's an old saying in the philosophy of science, which is that science advances one funeral at a time. It's kind of a grim view, but often you have I hate to say that in the context of your earlier comment, because it is the case that doctors who themselves are circumcised and who've been pushing this for years and years and years tend to be overrepresented in earlier generations when the rates were higher. So you had 80 or 90% of the male population circumcised. Now, out of the hospital anyway, it's about 50%, although a lot of circumcisions are done outside. So you're finding more doctors, male doctors, who simply have the tissue in question and think it would be kind of sad to lose it. And so when they're in these classes and they're starting to take up leadership positions, you see a slow amount of change. I had an article in the, what's that? Judges as well, yeah.
No.
So, yeah, I think it is a matter of generational change, just because when you've grown up and something's the norm, it's really hard to reconfigure your whole worldview.
On a quick comment, at the Pediatric Ethics Conference last summer in Seattle, I brought up that, doctors could just not do it or just inform parents that it's not necessary. And the view was that was seen as extreme. It's really not that extreme. We would just be more like how doctors respond to the question if it were even asked everywhere else in the world. And the panelists sort of like sat back and came up to me after and we chatted about it. And she's like, you're right. We're just not quite ready for it yet. So even some of the mainstream people not on a stage will concede, like, yeah, to some degree, but they're not quite ready to be that upfront.
You know, this practice depends on, this is a train, it's a moving train, right? And it's going to keep moving, and it depends on being able to roll down that track without a lot of friction. And this is still something that most doctors have bought into it either explicitly or implicitly or are afraid to oppose. The same thing with nurses. And the same thing with parents. Parents aren't even necessarily requesting it as much as they are acquiescing when it's pushed on them. So, you know, I had the same conversation with a pediatrician who told me that he had circumcised between 5,000 and 6,000 boys in his city in Maine, and his own son was not circumcised. And I said to him, you know, you stopped to talk to me. Obviously, you have some second, you know, some guesses, some doubts about this. Why don't you just stop? And he said, he sort of was very quiet, and he said, stopping would be very complicated. And I started to think about that. Bill is nodding his head, he's an attorney. Stopping is admitting that you did something that wasn't okay. It's having to confront the parents of the 5,000 boys in your town. The word gets around that you don't circumcise anymore. That, why did he circumcise my son? You know, why has he been doing this all these years? How much money has he made off circumcision? You know, did he put his intact son through college on dollars that he made from circumcising other people's sons? So it's true. Stopping is really complicated, but it's something that the medical community has done over the years. They have, on occasion, said, well, you know, we don't do that anymore. We thought that was okay, you know, but they're not there yet when it comes to circumcision.
There's a study by Andres Muller of doctors who either themselves are circumcised or not, or whose sons are circumcised or not, and just ask them whether they think, on balance, the medical literature supports or opposes the procedure. And what you find is what you'd expect, is that the people who have already circumcised their sons or who were themselves circumcised tend to think, well, objectively speaking, the medical literature suggests that the benefits outweigh the risks. And the opposite is true for those who hadn't circumcised their sons. And so you start to see that there's this relationship between what's already been done. If you've been circumcised, you can't really undo it. The restoration is a sort of partial solution. And so you're faced with a sort of cognitive dissonance. You either have to admit that maybe what was done to you ought not to have been done, which is psychologically very taxing, or you have to convince yourself that it was all things considered beneficial, and then you go ahead and carry on the practice.
The other thing I wanted to say as a Jewish woman with an intact son, I was lucky 35 years ago to meet Dr. Robert Mendelsohn, the people's doctor, Orthodox Jewish pediatrician from the University of Chicago. And in his book, How to Have a Healthy Child in Spite of Your Doctor, he was one of the very religious Jewish doctors who even 35 years ago was willing to admit the difference between the medical harm of circumcision and the Jewish reasons why he, at that time, would have considered it. I don't know. So then we were outside, I think it was AAP or maybe ACOG. We were protesting, and a Jewish doctor walked by and said, it's in the Old Testament, and I'm Jewish. And the man next to me said, I was circumcised by a Jewish doctor in a Catholic hospital, and I'm neither of those religions. Now, as a Jewish woman who was unable to impact any other male in my personal family except for my son, I decided that I would go more the medical route, not the Jewish, because it's a small percentage. But the thing that's been bothering me for a long time now is that the AAP task force and those doctors, so many of them are Jewish, and they are mixing, unlike Dr. Mendelsohn, they're using the medical, what they perceive as the medical benefits to justify the religion or vice versa, where it gets muddled, and they have, it seems, more clout than others. And I've been wondering, like, can a group of us Jewish people somehow go and speak to some of these people? Maybe it won't make a difference, but even the court cases, with the Greek parents where the doctor was Jewish, he didn't even consider that they were Greek and it wasn't done. It's just this cultural bias, and I know I don't think any of you are Jewish, so I'm not sure where to go with this. I think Lisa and Rebecca's book is amazing and making a difference in the community, but I think we still have a long way to go, and I'm not sure how to, if there's a way for us to do more, for the Jews to come together. I don't know.
Thanks for that comment. I think that's a very illuminating thing. I don't have anything to say in response because I think you so eloquently touched on some very important issues.
Agreed. Up front here.
I have two questions about the pain that's involved in the procedure. I often hear the argument that it's better to circumcise when the babies are newborn, just in case later on he needs to be circumcised for medical reasons or decides to, because the pain is, he'll feel less pain.
That's like the most garbage argument. You know, that, for one thing, it presumes just in case he'll have to be circumcised. He won't have to be circumcised. If he wants to be circumcised, I mean, I had a family member who used that rationale as why she was going to circumcise her son. You know, she's covered with tattoos. She said, you know, he won't want to go through the pain later. Well, number one, he won't have to if he doesn't want to, because he won't have to be circumcised. But number two, you decorated your body, you know, very painfully because you wanted to do that. You know, that was your choice. So, and nobody knows that argument is, the reason we circumcise babies is not because it's better for them. It's because we can tie them down.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's why we circumcise babies.
Yes.
We can't
Yes.
try doing that to a 12-year-old or a 15-year-old or a 25-year-old. You know, the idea, and so then this rationale that it hurts less, it heals faster, there are fewer complications. There's no evidence for any of that.
Exactly.
Bullshit.
Yeah.
Let me
There
make
is no evidence that there are fewer complications in infants. There's no evidence. There's no study that anybody can cite that shows the complication rate for infants as being less than the complication rate for adults who choose circumcision. It's just a lie. And anyone, as we know, if you are an adult and you have to undergo some kind of a painful medical procedure, you might not want to do it, it might be really distasteful, but you can understand, you can hear, you know, well, you'll hurt like hell for 3 days and then you'll feel better, or for 3 months if it's a knee replacement, but you know what's happening. A baby who's been on this planet for hours or days has no way of processing that information. That's an endless pain that they think they will never recover from. So those are absurd, really absurd positions.
Yeah, just one kind of comparison to follow up on this. So some women choose to get labiaplasty as adults for what they perceive to be cosmetic reasons. And you might say, well, it'll heal faster if we do it in infancy and you won't remember it and it might be less painful. Even if those claims were true, which they aren't true, at least in the case of circumcision. I don't know about neonatal labiaplasty because it's illegal. You'd be arrested if you did it. It's clearly not the case that the relative benefit to risk profile is the overriding moral concern here. Some people choose to have their bodies modified later if they wish, but you don't preemptively make that decision for the infant. On the matter of pain, the cultural anthropologist Rick Schwader tells a story about a Kenyan man that he was talking with when he was doing some research there. And he, as he likes to do, he asked him, are you circumcised? Because he does work on this topic. And the man said, yes, I was circumcised when I was 16 as an initiation rite into adulthood in my culture. And Rick said, well, was it painful? And he says, yes, it was excruciatingly painful. It was the most painful thing I've ever experienced. And it took a month for the wound to heal. And he said, but during that time I learned about the history of my people. I learned how to be a man. I learned how to take care of my family and so forth. And he said, what I don't understand is in the United States, you do it to an infant where the pain has no meaning. The infant has no way to process what's going on and put it in terms of something or prepare for it mentally or know that it's going to end. And so this Kenyan man would just thought that, we think these African initiation rites, there's a sort of tenor of the conversation thinking, well, that seems like the sort of barbaric thing to do. This Kenyan man thought that we didn't do in the United States is far more barbaric.
And if I can address, you said it's ingrained, and I know what you mean, but what's really ingrained, it's not that argument. It's the defense of infant circumcision. So you will find that if you can debunk that and say, no, but wait a minute, babies do feel pain and it's deeply imprinted, in their brain somewhere. The person, well, yeah, but then the baby won't get a urinary tract
They move on
infection.
to something
Oh,
else.
yeah, but then the baby won't be made,
Yeah.
the child won't be made fun of
Yeah.
in school. So it's the defense backed up by usually misinformation or a lack of information that is ingrained. That's why somebody referred, I don't know if it was you, Lori, to the argument, somebody else, the argument goes from religious freedom to urinary tract infections to HIV to complication rate, because what you're really looking at is an effort to defend the indefensible.
Yes.
Usually coming from a parent who has acquiesced to the circumcision of his or her child, or a man who has been circumcised and does not want to process how useless it was, or sometimes the partner of somebody like that. So that's really what is ingrained, is the need to defend.
Yeah.
The second part of my question is actually the healing process itself. We hear a lot about the pain involved.
The healing
In
process.
the procedure itself, but whenever you cut into a body part, the pain doesn't last just during the surgery. You feel pain during longer healing, but we don't hear much about it.
No, you don't hear much about the wound that's created by the circumcision, and the fact that the parent the new mother who was going home from the hospital with a baby and is going to have a lot to do, is now going to also have to engage in wound care. She's going to have to, every time she changes the baby's diaper, make sure that the tiny remnant of foreskin is not re-adhering to the glands, put Vaseline on it, wrap it in gauze. This is wound care on a perfectly formed newborn baby who has been maimed as part of a medical procedure usually, and now the parents have to deal with that. So you're absolutely right, it's not just the moment of circumcision. We focus on that as though you circumcise the baby, you wrap them up, you get them out of the hospital, and we're all good. But you're right, the healing process takes time.
I wanted to say a little bit about whose responsibility it is for the education, because there's a lot of deflection on that issue. When Intactivists protest at pediatric conferences, they say, well, we don't do that, it's the OBs. And when they're at the OBs, they say, well, we don't do that, it's the pediatricians. And they say, well, why don't we just do it because the parents ask? Now, parents tend to decide in general whether they're going to circumcise their kid or not quite early on. Okay, so yes, there are those last minute saves, but generally they know. Most don't even question at this point because we're not at the point of cultural awareness where people will question. So it tends to be during when the woman's pregnant and there's an OB. If a woman went in with a healthy pregnancy and said, I would like a scheduled C-section, it is that OB's responsibility to say, well, okay, well, why? What are the myths? Why are they requesting that? Does she know it's not medically necessary? Does she know that there are surgical risks? Does she know that there are future risks for future pregnancies? So it is the OB's responsibility to figure out why is that choice, why is that being requested, and are there myths playing into why she's requesting that surgery. For some reason, I think we know why, if the parents say, yes, we'd like you to circumcise our kid, they say, okay. No question about,
No
and why
question.
are you requesting that, and to see if they believe a whole bunch of myths that the doctor should myth bust. Because consent is not supposed to be a question, it's supposed to be a dialogue. And it's the OB that has that relationship with the woman and the couple throughout the pregnancy who that is the responsibility of. So more so than the pediatricians, though on West Coast pediatricians, it's the OBs that are really failing in that consent process when it comes to circumcision?
I think there's a lot of aspects of this issue, like you just mentioned, that under scrutiny really don't make a lot of sense. And that's because for most people, this issue is not intellectual, it is emotional, it's psychological. And if it was just intellectual, the three people up here alone could dispel every myth and we would be done and that would be it. But many of the things that people believe and hold on to aren't actually intellectually examined beliefs as much as psychological defenses. Because there's a lot to feel around this, and it's very difficult for people to feel. All the way in the back there.
Thanks. So first I just want to say congratulations to the filmmaker Brendon, because I think
Yeah.
totally just outstanding film, and what is a really, really difficult topic, and it's a testament to not only all the work I put into it, but also storytelling capability. And also I was particularly gratified with all the in-depth interviews with people, some of the people who have passed away, like Arwayne Griffiths and John McConty, and even Dr. Schoen. And so on that, actually, one of the main things that I'd never seen done before that was done in your film was your interviews with these heavy proponents of genital cutting. So Dr. Friedman, Dr. Schoen, Brian Morris, and my question for you, my first question is, can you tell us about the filmmaking process or the documentary making process, how you went about securing these interviews, convincing these people to speak with you so openly?
I'd like to know that too. I'm very curious.
And then my second question for you in the panel, I think that anyone in this room could tell that Brian Morris and Dr. Schoen are not playing with a full deck of cards. But Dr. Friedman, on the other hand, and also the doctor that you were interviewing who was performing the cutting, they both seem fairly rational. So how do these doctors, particularly from an ethical point of view, how do they reconcile this totally obvious ethical hypocrisy that they're espousing, and with the two most obvious points being that they understand, or should understand, particularly Dr. Friedman, that the baby is the patient, not the parent. So how can you sign his name to that? And then the other one being the point that Georganne made in the film, where the risks have never been studied, and yet Dr. Friedman signed his name to a piece of paper whose main point was that the risks, the benefits outweigh the risks. How can he put his name to that? And when you're dealing with these people, all of you, what have you seen as the reaction from these people to that kind of just totally obvious argument to a rational person? Thanks.
So I'll answer the first question, which is how I got the range of interview subjects we did. And many of the pro-circumcision people who appear in the film were very eager to debate the Intactivists. Brian Morris in particular, one of the questions that I always ask towards the end of an interview is there anything that I haven't asked you that you think we should talk about? And he said, well, yeah, the Intactivists bring up this point, and I want to rebut that. And so he was very interested in debating them. But early on in the process, I was a little worried about that. I reached out to someone who was both a urologist and a moil, a Jewish ritual circumciser. I thought, great, he can cover both of those perspectives. And before I could even get too far into what the film was about, he said, well, are you going to interview those Intactivists? Because if you interview them, then I don't even want to be in the film, and I want final edit over anything that I'm in. And I thought, I'm not going to give you executive producer privileges just to be in the movie. But it made me a little worried, so, and I want to be honest with my interview subjects. I want to let them know what the film is about and be upfront with them. And so, but at the same time, I was worried if I told them, I'm interviewing both sides and making a balanced film that covers both those perspectives, that there'd be people who wouldn't appear in the film. And so I got a book on documentary filmmaking that had an ethics section, and I thought, okay, well, I'm just going to follow whatever this says. And I opened it up, and it said that you should give your documentary interview subjects informed consent, and then it gave the medical definition of informed consent. And I thought that's not helpful at all, because there's virtually no informed consent on this issue. You know, the informed consent for circumcision is, would you like your child circumcised? And that's it. None of the information that you see in this film is presented. So I went with that sort of initially when I was approaching interview subjects. I would say, I'm doing a documentary on circumcision. Would you like to be in it? And any questions they had, I was completely upfront about. There are some interview subjects who I gave, you know, my entire personal perspective on the issue. And there were some who were just really eager to debate the Intactivists, and that was Edgar Schoen and Brian Morris. They sort of knew that was their opposition, so to speak, and they were eager to speak against them. And so that was kind of how I got the range of interview subjects there in the film. And I'm, you know, like people have asked how, like they're thinking that there might be some resistance there, but they're actually very eager to debate this. It's those who are sort of more on the fence or not, or are doing the procedure but not speaking on it, who are harder to get on camera. And then in the case of Andrew Freeman, that connection actually came through Georganne, who could probably speak to a little bit to your second question, which is how it is that some of the more lucid seeming voices in the pro-circumcision group can say what they say and believe what they believe. Unless you don't want to go into that.
I'm happy to. So Freeman is extremely interesting because you're right. He signed his fact. He was, I think, the head of the task force or the principal author of the 2012 paper that said that circumcision's benefits outweighed its risks and all of that terrible stuff. And he's been vilified by all of us for many years, including for circumcising his own son on his parents' kitchen table, and we all knew that. Then in 2016, he wrote an essay that was published in the journal Pediatrics that said, you know, all this stuff about circumcision, you know, medical and not, he said it here, we're never gonna resolve it on that. It's a cultural custom. Some parents want their kids circumcised, some parents don't want their kids circumcised. Jews will circumcise because they're part of the tribe, some Jews don't, some Jews do, I did. But really, you're never going to win it on the merits of a medical argument, or win it or lose it. So I sent him an email with asking him to clarify some confusing sentence. I just picked something out of his article, his essay, and sent him an email. I had a response in, I don't know, 15 minutes, where he explained that. And so I wrote him back, and we started writing each other back. And by the way, Tony LaSquadra also had corresponded with him around the same time. We were both corresponding with him. And he said to me, you know, I'd love to meet you. If you are ever in LA, let me know, and I'll take you to dinner. So I looked at my schedule, and I sent him a note, and I said, actually, I'll be in LA in, you know, a couple weeks. What day would be good for you? And I flew out and met him for dinner. And we split the bill at a very, very fancy Asian restaurant across from Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. And he said, you know, my conclusion is he really wants to be liked. And he wants us to like him, you know, Intactivist. He thinks, and I'll say this, he thinks we're bigger than we are. He actually thinks we're quite powerful, and he thinks that the different anti-circumcision organizations, he kind of wanted to know how big they are. He's listening, and he's watching. His taint, if you will, is being a doctor, and being a urologist, and being a surgeon. He thinks he can fix anything. He thinks he can fix, I said, what do you say to a parent who has a child who's been horribly botched? What do you say? And he says, I say, bring him to me and I'll fix him. Then he also told me, and I might disbelieve him in his numbers or in the extremeness of what he said. He said to me, I've talked more parents out of circumcising than you have. He said, when somebody comes to me and tells me they want to circumcise their boy, I ask them why. And I tell them, you know, it's not necessary. So he considers himself a balanced good guy in the fight. And it kind of makes him feel really bad to think that so I think he spoke to Brendon. So then I was speaking to Brendon shortly after this conversation, and I said, you want to talk to Andy Friedman? I think he'll talk to you. And he agreed immediately, right? And I think he will never give up the position that it's a parent's right to make the choice in the current cultural climate. You know, I think he'll stick with that. But I do think that he knows it's not medically even beneficial. And he's really just staying by his doctor training, which says it's allowed, people do it, parents want it, and it should be an option. Now, that doesn't make him our friend, but he's not somebody he's not an Edgar Schoen, he's not a Doug Dikema, who will look you in the face and parrot some ethical garbage, and then, you know, defend circumcision. So he's a complex guy, but he's not a mortal enemy to our cause.
There are, I would say many, a lot, there are some providers who don't like doing circumcisions. They know it's not necessary, but they think, or maybe they actually are better at doing it than others. So they feel they are saving, like, I know the person who teaches how to do them at Yale in the midwifery program. She teaches how to do them. She says, I don't like doing them, but she does them because at least they're not getting done by somebody else. And that happens more than you may know. When I started teaching my class at a more mainstream OB practice, it was because it was in Arizona, so it tended to be pediatricians. And there were a couple pediatricians who did them in the hospital that the midwives all really discouraged more than normal parents from circumcising when they were the ones going to do it. So in a meeting, it's huge OB practice. It was like 15 different practices in the state. The director, the business director, would say, hey, well, we're thinking of having the OB start doing circumcisions now because these botched ones with the pediatricians. And the midwives freaked out because they didn't want them being done. But it was this belief that, hey, at least he's a surgeon, at least it's going to be better than these pediatricians or whoever drew the short straw. So there are a number who, if they knew conscientious objection was a thing that they could do for circumcision, and if they felt their career or their employment wasn't on the line, I think a lot more would stop doing them.
You know, I think it's just important to say, I know exactly what you're referring to. I've had people tell me, I hate it, but I do it because I'm the best at it. Well, it's like, how'd you get to be the best? You must have done a whole lot to be the best. I know people say that, and I know they believe it, and I would never give somebody a pass on that. Because as far as I'm concerned, if you hate it and you think it's a terrible thing to do, and you're violating their child's rights, you know, if some parent brought you their child and said, cut off his little finger, you'd say, no, I don't do that. Nothing wrong with his little finger. So it is something, and it's why we need to reach this tipping point so that doctors who profess to hate doing it, or do hate doing it, can stand up with other doctors who hate doing it and say, we don't do that. We're not doing that. This practice does not circumcise. This OB practice does not circumcise boys. You want to circumcise your boy, you go somewhere else. Of course, that's the American doctor's fear. What would happen if you stop circumcising? Well, they might take their baby somewhere else. They might have their baby somewhere else. That's why hospitals don't take a stand against it, because they go across town and have their baby there because they circumcise. So that's why you need to reach this social disapproval, where it's the consensus is that this is a bad thing to do.
I really think that these stories point to how psychological the issue is. I mean, so the doctor who does a circumcision in my film is very similar to what you described. There was a very high botch rate in his area, and there was a news story done on him about a presentation he was giving on botch repair, and that's a huge portion of his practice. And there was so much that he was essentially doing them himself and talking about how, you know, the OBs say, oh, you don't need to use anesthesia. He goes right into shock, as if that's a good thing and not, you know, a primal wound. And so he was doing the actual, you know, it takes 5 minutes for the anesthesia to take effect. And I reached out to him and said, originally I was just going to interview him about botch repair because I thought that would be a segment that I'd want in the film. And he said, oh, you want to film the procedure while you're here, right? And I was like, okay? And there are a lot of, and Georganne mentioned some things about Andrew Freeman. When you start getting into the issue, there's that much psychology there. I mean, there's an interview subject who I ended up not including in the film, who will be in the bonus features, who I'm pretty sure interviewed with me because he wanted to be liked. And he knew my full perspective on the issue. I talked to him about some of my personal things, but he saying no to the interview would be rejecting someone, and then they might not like him. And in the case of Edgar Schoen and Brian Morris, they want to be seen as the expert. And being the interview subject in a documentary means they're the expert. And when you get into this issue, every person's psychology is that complex. In the case of Andrew Freeman, he makes the argument essentially that where the medical benefits are not enough to recommend circumcision, that there basically isn't any significant medical benefit. This is what he says, but that we should continue doing circumcision because we have a lot of different cultures and a lot of different beliefs, and they should be allowed to do what they want. And so his argument is essentially, it's not good, but my tribe wants to do it, and that's part of my identity, and so you can't take that away from me. And it's really interesting, because what seems like an academic argument is actually a reflection of the way that he feels inside and something about his identity. And yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, it's sort of a reverse of the genital cutting of women in cultures that cut women. It was tribal in the bush with traditional circumcisions, and now they are medicalizing it to try and legitimize it. And here it is medicalized, and they're like, well, can we? Like, what role does or should doctors have in performing cultural or religious rituals? If we refuse to do it, well, then it goes to the non-medically trained. It's sort of like a reversal, a flip-flop of the path female cutting activists have gone. We're sort of going the reverse, and it's just a double standard that's getting a lot harder to ignore.
I'll also say, Georganne's talked about reaching a tipping point. Since this issue is so psychological, the most powerful persuasive tool is social proof. And so that's why that's so important, because if you reach a certain percentage, then it's okay to talk about. And one of the things I appreciate, Brian mentioned, between 10 and 13% of men feeling unhappy about being circumcised. I noticed that I think that number could be greater if given social proof. And I noticed this because when I meet people, they ask, what do you do? And I say, I'm a filmmaker. And they say, oh, interesting, what are you working on? And I think, okay, here we go. And I tell them, and I've noticed that when I talk to men, and I say, well, it's about the modern debate around circumcision and the growing movement that says that men should be able to make their own choices about their bodies, you can kind of see their eyes like, think for a minute, and they go like, yeah, that makes sense. And I can see that there's a feeling that they've had about this issue that's never been given permission to be expressed publicly, and just another man talking about, not even my own feelings, but the fact that there's other people in the world who feel that way is enough for them to go, yeah, I kind of wish that wasn't done to me, or I don't really know why that was done, or whatever feeling they have will come out. And working on this film, even though there's a lot of mixed reactions, inevitably someone will say, I've never told anyone this story, or you've probably never heard anything like this, and they're telling a lot of the same stories, but they don't realize there's other people who feel the same way because it's not talked about.
Just a comment and a question. My comment is that in about 6 weeks, the Society of Pediatric Urologists, Dr. Friedman, is going to be giving a talk. My understanding is that the subject of it is going to be bias in circumcision as it's described on social media. Now, aside from the obvious hot kettle problem that he has giving that address, I guess it's based on something that he said, or not based on, but inconsistent with something that he said in his 2016 essay that was published in Pediatrics. There he made, among other things, he made the comment that, in his view, what Intactivists should be doing is focusing on trying to make the foreskin more popular and make it seem like a good thing and convince the court of public opinion in that way. Just from my own experience, I can say that I kept my 2 sons intact, and I didn't do it because I thought that it would get them elected student body president. I did it because it's not my choice. It's not up to me to make that call. And I guess this leads me into my question. At one point in the film, Dr. Friedman says, well, we as Americans have to decide what is ethical or not. And he goes on to make the comments we've already talked about wanting his tribe. Isn't he in the physician tribe? Isn't he a member of that tribe? Isn't he also a member of the pediatrician tribe? And didn't the AAP's Committee on Bioethics more than 20 years ago say that unless it is to treat or diagnose a presently existing condition, surgery without the informed consent of the patient himself should not be done? Or if it's done in a trial, it needs to be done only with his assent. Brendon, did you ask those kinds of follow-up questions to Dr. Friedman when he asked the question, you know, we're the process of trying to decide what our ethics are. Isn't he already subject to an ethical code that he's blatantly violating?
So when I'm interviewing someone, I'm not usually trying to debate them. What I will do is say, you know, a lot of your critics have said this, or a lot of Intactivists have said this, and how do you respond to it? And he's aware of those arguments, but I think that he underestimates the pain that men feel around this issue. And his attitude is that, well, most people are happy with it, and some are a little unhappy, and some would probably be a little unhappy if they hadn't had it done, but basically everyone's okay. And so, I mean, that's basically the summation.
Another thing that we found out in our first survey was that Americans did not buy the human rights argument. They didn't care. They did not care about the human rights argument. It did not move them. And pre-test, post-test, it was infinitesimal, the number of Americans who cared about that argument of children's rights or human rights. Doctors are American, we're talking about American doctors in American culture, and they do enough things that, I taught nurses last summer, I taught a bioethics course to nurses last summer, and I found the same thing, that, and these were advanced practice nurses, they were getting their doctorates, and they felt like, yeah, I went through basic bioethics, like the first 2 weeks of the course, and then we got into the issues. And most of the people in the class could not really grapple with the dilemmas posed by the ethics, and they just resorted to, yeah, but we do this all the time, and we're allowed to do it, and in fact, we're taught to do it, so, you know, it's okay. Because they didn't know how they were going to personally or as a group mobilize against an ethical violation. They just couldn't do, and I think that physicians are in the same place. If they can't figure out how, I mean, ethics are, they can't figure out what they're supposed to do, and everybody around them seems to be doing this practice. It's just not compelling to them.
If you recall that article I mentioned where the European physicians responded to the 2012 AAP policy, well, the AAP wrote a very interesting little rebuttal back where they said, you say that we're culturally biased, but we have a 50% circumcision rate. You have close to 0 circumcision rate, therefore you're culturally biased against circumcision. And I wrote a paper sort of responding to this little debate where I said, it's true that there's a sort of cultural norm that differs between Europe and the United States with respect to modified or unmodified genitalia. I mean, Europeans don't modify women's genitalia either, so it's true that they have that norm. But I said there's also a shared medical norm between these cultural contexts, which suggests you don't perform surgery on healthy children. So what about that norm? And I think that point gets lost in this debate of, well, we do it, you don't do it, and there are some established principles that circumcision is this weird asterisk where they don't get applied to that case.
I'm really enjoying this discussion, but I just checked the time, and I think that we are technically at the end of the Q&A panel. I just saw the manager in the back too, looking at me, so I get the sense that we should probably head out soon. But I will stick around after. We also have tons of info cards for the film. I have more than I can possibly take with me, so please take as many as you'd like. There's a sheet out there that asks how you heard about the screening tonight. I would love it if you put your name and email down and let us know. And
Brendon, do we have to leave the building or just the theater? I guess I'm asking the manager also. Can we come?
she just took off, so I don't know.
Can we congregate downstairs if people want to continue asking questions?
Give it a shot.
Do they have a bouncer?
I don't know.
Okay, well, we'll see.
We'll find out the hard way.
There's a lot of nearby places. I'm sure we will find one. And I know that there's still questions people have, and so hopefully we'll get to talk about them out in the lobby or somewhere nearby. Thank you for coming.